In this video, I'd like to look at how and why the USA expanded in the years 1789 to 1831. So building on what we learnt about the USA in 1789 in the last video. Now the USA in the years 1789 to 1831 expanded a lot. The original 13 colonies are those states that you can see in blue on the far right hand side of this screen. So that area that's sort of white in colour was really where USA was in 1789. By the end of 1831, so really only 42 years later, actually the USA had expanded all the way through that yellow region, all the way through that purple region. So there was an awful lot of expansion. In fact, it went from what was a slither on the east coast to pretty much being half the country it is to this day. Now you can see here that there are really two big expansions in this period. Firstly, the expansion into the yellow region, which is the Northwest and the Southwest territories. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then the second big expansion was into that purple region, which is Louisiana. Now, that's how the USA expanded in the years 1789 to 1831. But I think there's a really big natural question with this, a big historical question, and that is, how was that possible? How was it that those 13 colonies were able to expand so far and so fast? Because we're talking about a region that's hundreds and hundreds of miles. How was it possible they were able to expand so far and so fast? And it's that I want to look at today, and we're going to look at 4 big reasons that the USA were able to do that. So the first reason that the US were able to expand was because they had the forced taking of Native American land. They took Native American land. So before 1783, the British claimed control over the area in yellow. So the area in yellow you can see here. That area in yellow was obviously Native American land. The Native Americans had been there for centuries, if not really millennium, and the British claimed control of it. They didn't really own it, but they claimed control. Now, after 1783, when the British were defeated, they gave that land, which they didn't really own, to the United States. So in 1783, the British gave the land to the United States. It wasn't yet states, it was territories. And settlers began to move into that region. And the area north of the Ohio River, which you can see in the middle of the map here, was called the Northwest Territory. And the area to the south was called the Southwest Territory. This was Native American land that the Americans were taking, that the white settlers were taking. Now, President Washington was worried that the Native Americans might join up with the British in Canada to fight the USA. So he spent vast sums, huge sums, on war against them. Massive sums. And at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which you can see in this painting behind the text here, in 1794, the US defeated the Native Americans. Their leaders were forced to sign a brutal treaty, the Treaty of Greenville, and they essentially gave up their land. That yellow land was now officially the USA. That wasn't the only reason, though. The second reason was that they encouraged settlers. So although they'd officially gained that land, they needed white American settlers to start farming on it, in farms that would have looked similar to this picture here. And Jefferson, we've came across him in the last video, who was president at the start of the 19th century, tried to encourage settlers to move west. And he wanted to do it quickly. And he wanted to do it quickly so that the white settlers would take over that land. And to do that, he divided the land into 640 acre plots. Now 640 acres is a massive area. A massive area. And even though he was selling them relatively cheap, most people could not afford a plot that size. But actually, farmers move anyway. They move regardless, and those people become squatters on the land. So they are there squatting, taking over bits of land that they shouldn't really have, that they have no legal right to in any way. Now, the people that could afford that land were called land speculators. And land speculators buy up those 640-acre plots that Jefferson wants to sell quite quickly, and they buy them very fast, and they then sell on smaller plots. So they split their 640 acres into smaller plots which people can afford. That obviously brings them into tension though with the squatters who were already in those regions. Now, all of that does cause tension, but what does happen is that settlers quite rapidly move into those new regions. So settlers move into the Northwest and the Southwest territories and really start farming that land. The third reason that the USA expands in this period is because of something known as the Louisiana Purchase. So in 1800, the French claimed the land in purple as their own. So the purple region that you can see here, which starts down in Louisiana as it is today, in New Orleans, goes up pretty much all the way, following the Missouri and the Mississippi rivers, and covers an immense region of land. Now, you may already know this, but at the start of the 19th century, the French were, funnily enough, preoccupied. And they were preoccupied because they were already fighting a war against the British in Europe. So Napoleon is fighting the war with the British in Europe. And the French forces had also very recently faced a quite humiliating defeat against ex-slaves in Haiti and during a rebellion. So as a result of this, the French decide that they don't want this land anymore. They don't want this land because they're worried that actually it's too much of a hassle. And as a result, they make a deal with Jefferson. And in 1803, Jefferson buys that land from the French. And he buys it for $15 million. For the size of that land, it was a massive steal. So he purchased Louisiana. The Louisiana Purchase, as it's known, means that the US gains a ridiculous amount of land. Land, again, I should point out, that was Native American land, really, but was claimed over by these colonialists. Now, the fourth reason that the US is able to expand in this period is because explorers start really establishing new trade routes and new routes across that land. And if you imagine that America is so vast and it's got mountains and rivers and plains and even in the west deserts, they needed to establish safe routes across those lands so that trade could expand. And Jefferson sent two explorers in particular to establish trade routes to the Pacific. So the Pacific in the west, he sends explorers, and those two explorers are known as Lewis and Clark. They're the most famous, although other explorers are sent too. Now, Lewis and Clark meet many Native American tribes along the way, and actually are even helped by some. So Sacagawea, who is shown also in this picture here, is a Shoshone woman, and she acted as their guide, and she shows them routes, the Native American routes that they've established for years. She shows these white settlers the new routes, and those new routes are really quite impressive. So Lewis and Clark, and by the way, this has taken over nearly a 2-year period. Lewis and Clark leave from the Northwest Territory in St. Louis, and they get all the way to the Pacific over a massive, massive distance through the mountains, through the plains, and that is a huge distance. But these explorers, really importantly as well, really established trade routes, and trade routes for fur, and beaver fur in particular, which you can see one of them wearing a beaver fur hat in this picture. And those trade routes allow the US to expand again. So really, to sum up, the USA expands massively in the years 1789 to 1831. I mean, if you look at that map there, really they expand from the region that was the 13 colonies originally, really expands maybe 6-7 times that period in 40 years. And they do that, and they expand for 4 big reasons. The most important is they take Native American land. They encourage settlers to move in on that land. They purchase the Louisiana Purchase from the French, and Lewis and Clark established trade routes. So 4 big reasons that really enable them to expand in these years.